David, welcome to the Controversial Exchange.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. Um, yeah, I know we've chatted about this a little bit already, but as soon as I saw that email come through, I mean, these are all my favorite topics wrapped into one. Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited.
Well, before we get started, why don't you tell everybody kind of who you are and what you do, like what you're into, what you do for a living, and that kind of thing, because
sure.
I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, so I currently work as a principal analyst at Guidewell in Jacksonville, Florida. And essentially, my day-to-day is trying to take behavioral interventions, choice, preference assessments, all those things related to health behavior, scale it up in the digital space. So we try to automate a lot of those processes, and then bring in machine learning, data science as a tool to try to help us, because that can be challenging. You know, we have Guidewell, they owned a bunch of different companies. One of them is Florida Blue Cross Blue Shield's health insurance company. And they have, millions of members. So when you think about how do I take a behavioral intervention and try to help people, go to the doctor for their annual visits, that's not really like a one-on-one intervention you can pull off. You got to scale it. So that's kind of what I currently do. What got me here? So I started out as a behavior technician, RBT. It wasn't called that back in the day because I'm old. But as direct therapist, working with kids with ASD, DD. Got my BCBA and a master's in bioethics. I was originally interested in med school, but then found while I was working at an interdisciplinary clinic, getting this master's in bioethics, found behavior analysis and realized you can actually think about that stuff for a living. So switched over, got my BCBA, worked clinically for a few years, had a caseload, all that fun stuff. Realized I was really interested in research and choice in particular, and how we can play around with math to describe the decisions that we were making as clinicians. So that led me to my PhD, University of Florida, Jesse Dallery, a lot of EAB, lab, quant, VB stuff. After that, I was still really interested in trying to think about the healthcare space and how we can play around with judgment decision making. So that led me to Johns Hopkins for a postdoc. And it was there that I got really heavy into data science and machine learning, and how we can use that as a tool. And then that kind of brought me to my current gig.
Oh man, this guy is basically living my dream.
I look at him as a behavioral unicorn. Like there's one of you, man. There's one. I mean, with the experience and all the different areas that you bring in, it's super cool.
So I was chatting with this guy who ran the behavioral pharmacology research unit at Hopkins, where I did my postdoc. And I remember asking him, like, how'd you get into psychiatry? Because he's a psychiatrist. And he told me that at every point in his career, bachelor's, master's, all that good stuff, when he saw the group zig, he zagged. And that's how he was able to kind of stay unique and get to where he was at. And I always thought that was really good advice. Maybe the audience will get something from that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, hey, man, I think there's something to be said about not necessarily being a contrarian, but marching to your own beat. And that sounds like that's what you did, my man. Well, you want to get started?
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right. Well, how about this? Why don't we start with something just basic? Why study decision making and not, FA or motivating operations or, DROs?
Yeah.
Why study decision making or choice making?
That's a good question. And I don't know. I feel like everybody had to have had this experience. Maybe they haven't. But I remember, because I've been really interested in ethics for a long time. And I remember, I'm in this bioethics program and I'm sitting there thinking about how complex these decisions are and all this fun stuff and what language does. And then I found behavior analysis. And not only do you realize that it can explain a lot of what we do, but it explains a lot of what I do, like moment by moment. And I remember when that kind of clicked for me, I remember thinking how fascinating it would be for someone to follow me around with like a camera, and just like figure out why am I making all these decisions that I do. Point being, kind of within that whole process, I've always been fascinated with this idea of spinning behavior analysis back on ourselves for like self-assessment. And that kind of carried over into the clinical space when I became a BCBA. And it was, you're looking around and you start to ask, like, why am I making the clinical decisions I'm doing? This context isn't directly like what I read in Java. Realistically, my client, I'm pulling in like 40 articles to piece together a program, and nobody's researched how those all fit together, or how I'm like playing with. So long story short, I've always been kind of fascinated with this idea of turning back in and questioning, why do I have the beliefs that I do? Why am I engaged in the behaviors I'm engaging? I think that naturally leads you to like adult decision making in a clinical context. And then you get in there and there's so many unanswered questions, and you realize how hard it is. And
oh, dude, it's, I mean, I'm going down the rabbit hole myself right now. Literally, I'm putting together a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm like, all right, what's the first slide need to be? It needs to be a rabbit staring down a hole, tripping on acid. Because when you go down this,
kicks the rabbit in the next slide.
But I mean, like, for real, it looks. I mean, reading some of this stuff and going down it, it has a psychedelic effect on your mind. Like, at least for me, it did.
Yeah.
It had in the last 3 weeks. It's been like for a bunch of different reasons. Number one is if you start off with a couple of basic questions and you try to answer them, like you were just saying, I think is the best way to go about it. And for what you're saying when it comes to decision making, how I got to this point where I wanted to have this conversation with you is I wanted to ask the question, how do we measure private events? I mean, we're radical behaviorists or functional contextualists, but we only measure overt behavior. We only really look at things through the lens of overt behavior. And if we're monists and holists and all those other isms, we have to somehow blend these two things and actually approach it in that way. So what are the different types of ways that we measure them? And I started tugging on that thread, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go down a quantitative path because I understand derived relational responding for the most part. I get that research is out there, but it's got a lot of critics. What do the smartest people in the room have to say about this? And that would be, quantitative, squab, EAB types. You know what I mean? The real nerds. And that put me down this road of quantitative models. Yeah. And for anybody who's wondering, quantitative models are basically where you represent reality or nature with math, bottom line. And I got a friend who's into evolutionary theory of behavioral dynamics. So if anyone's interested, that's McDowell. There's a lot of stuff that he does. And then I landed on this thing, the social gravity shit, because when I was looking at evolutionary theory of behavioral dynamics, I noticed that it still had an anchor in the physical world, and it does provide a reasonable explanatory framework for things. But from a quantitative sense and just from a predictive sense, there's something a little bit missing for the uncertainty that we see in the world. And what I saw, one of the things from your paper that I read that I thought was interesting is that really what you're studying a lot of the time with this stuff isn't necessarily the choice making itself, but the different relationships between the different stimuli and the person. And what you're really measuring is the dynamics amongst the different levers that are getting pulled. So it's almost like you're actually really identifying or measuring the wavelengths and relative positions of stuff and not the things in and of themselves. And I think that's a really hard thing to wrap your brain around. Because when you're talking about magnitude and quantifying it effectively and measuring it and all that stuff, it's really hard. So I know I just said a bunch of shit that sounds crazy or whatever. But I mean, like, what are your thoughts on quantitative models in terms of explanatory frameworks? And do you think that's a thing that we should be looking more at?
Oh, absolutely, we should.
I have a follow-up question off of this.
Yeah. So I'm biased. So I think what hooked me, I think, when all the dots connected, as in that bioethics program, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I was studying to take the MCAT and was going through, classical mechanics and physics. And I remember reading about mass gravity and thinking, like, there's got to be a behavioral parallel, like you think about this reinforcement history and maybe it gains like momentum or whatever. And I started hashing this thing and writing these absurd equations. And then this BCBA that worked with us casually at the time was like, oh, you mean like behavioral momentum theory? I was like, wait, what? Someone's done this. Found Tony Nevin, 30 years ago he did it. Long story short, that's what kind of hooked me, because I think there's power in the ability to describe precisely the influence of one variable on another and to make those predictions. And the quantitative analyses of behavior give you that in a way that my guess is a lot of people don't appreciate, because it's not just that reinforcement will increase the rate of responding, but by how much, to what degree.
Well, they bring in probability, man. They bring in nature. They bring in reality. And it's a really hard place to arrive to a probabilistic mindset when you're trying to imagine that, because when you look at, we're taught the 3-term contingency. Like, the biggest thing that I think that in the podcast, and this is a question I've had and I haven't quite been able to answer it for myself, and I'm finally starting to come to why I feel this sense of incongruity with what I know to be quote unquote behavior analysis versus what I wish it was, and why I get so fucking mad at psychology, because I feel like they're untethered and can do whatever they want, and like we live in this like very mechanistic, reductionistic framework. And in reality, that's actually not true. If you really look at the robustness of all the different literature that's been done, if you really do synthesize it together, the three-term contingency becomes a single point in time for a single data variable amongst a variety of necessary variables to produce an effective predictive model, which is what we're supposed to be doing when we're thinking about true science. Because you're talking about that capital T truth, it's not just control, it's prediction. That's because then when you can illuminate the future, I mean, you've, as Nietzsche would say, become God. But anyway, yeah, I'm with you, dude. I'm falling in love with it every single day more and more. I honestly though don't have the math chops for it. What do you think about that?
I would say, I remember when I first saw it too, and I loved math growing up, but I never got like into it in college because I didn't have any reason to do it. And so when I first contacted quantitative analyses of behavior and some of the more advanced models that I try to scare myself like once a day, trying to get into the weeds. It's like anything else, it's like the first JAB paper you read and you're like, what the fuck is this? But you read a JAB paper and then the next one and the next one. And next thing you know, you're crushing issues and volumes and things. So it's one of those things that you just got to practice. The other thing I'll say about it is math is just verbal behavior. It's just a different way of describing the world. And so it's like learning French or German, or Icelandic. It's a bit rough at first, but once you get it down and you become fluent with it, then you start to see how easy it actually is. And technology these days makes it even easier for us.
Well, numerical stenography is what I like to think of it as.
That was one of the questions I had. Because I kind of, at one point during my BA career, trying to figure out what to study, ran in the crossroads of like, do I keep diving in this JAB and following all of this math that's going on here? And I had, chops in high school up till calculus. I don't know how far those would have gone. I believe that, you put a lot of work in, you can keep learning that stuff, and I probably could have, but I chose to kind of pivot away from it. And there was a number of interactions I had with behavior analysts where it came down to like, hey, math is like a language and it's a way to describe the natural phenomenon out there, much like our behavior analytic terminology is. And so for me there, it was just kind of like, oh, there's two ways of talking about it, but I don't know. I didn't feel like math was going to be the end all be all when I talk to people like that. Do you believe that way? Or is it like, is it a better language for behavior, I guess? Or it's different. It's hard to say better, but
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And the first thing that I'll say, just because you mentioned like calculus, so the math that we play around with in behavior analysis is not that complex. We maybe have a ratio. We're dividing one thing by another. That's about as complex as it gets. Algebra, if people know algebra, they can do quant in behavior analysis. Just wanted to throw that out there. The second thing is I don't know that math is like, it depends on the function of your behavior, right? So like if I'm trying to create an intervention for an EIBI kid to get him to talk more, I don't know that you really need math for that. Mm-hmm. Right? Matching law tells us that you provide more reinforcement for the behavior you want to see. It doesn't really help me in any capacity. Delayed discounting tells me, give the reinforcer sooner. I don't really need math to tell me what to do there. But where I find math helpful is when we start to build towards complexity and dynamics. So when I have not just one variable, but I have 20 that I know are coming to play on a moment of choice, and each one of those is paired with a unique learning history, and I need to try to distill that down into a prediction, one decision, do you go left or do you go right? And that's where I think math starts to help you, because you get into, you think, and nobody, I don't think, believe this anymore, but like classic Skinner response strength, it rises until it meets a threshold and then the behavior occurs, right? That's a classic idea. The same idea could be extended to the like quantitative analyses of multivariate situations. I can understand through your reinforcement history how each one of those increases or decreases the probability of two options. And at that moment of choice, one has a slightly higher probability, we assume that behavior occurs. That's where you get into like reinforcement value and things. That's
Yeah.
really all we're trying to do.
So one of the readings that I was doing at the time that didn't tip me over the edge, I would say, like sold me on like put all the math aside, but it was I guess really powerful for me, was an example from Xingyang Guo. And this was written for context in 1967, and from his research, I think that was conducted largely from the 40s and 50s and 60s. So like I kept that in mind. Keep that in mind also when I read this, because it's over 50 years now that this quote is. But I want to read this for you real quick, and then we can maybe chat about it. So he says, I believe this is a direct quote. I'm reading this from a slide that I made like 8 years ago that I probably shouldn't have made, because I clearly delivered this and talked about it in front of an audience, and yet still wasn't the expert. So anyhow, he says, if many learning theorists have apparently succeeded in their mathematical predictions that can be explained by the fact that they have ignored the great complexity and variability of behavior and have reduced behavioral phenomenon to an extremely few simple parameters. So for example, the behavior of a fly would be very complicated if we were to take into account the complexity, variability, and interplay of such determining factors as morphology, biophysics, biochemistry, developmental history, environmental context, and the various characteristics of the simulating objects. However, if we simply put a fly in a very small blackened box with two small openings, both penetrated by outside light and a stream of cold air through one opening and a stream of warm air through the other, we would predict with almost mathematical accuracy by which the two openings the fly would escape from the box and in how many trials. But in doing so, we must ignore the details of the fly's activities inside the black box. In other words, the success of such an experimental prediction is due not to the accuracy of mathematical theories or models, but rather to the oversimplification of experimental situation and animal learning. And with this, I think really he was trying to head down the route of like, these could be possible, but you run into this problem. And it was, I feel like, kind of similar to Ogden Lindsley, like they were held back by the technology and the limitations of the time of like what was capable. Like they were almost just born too soon. But I don't know, it kind of brings up two things for me. Like, are we still in this world of like potentially oversimplifying it and it's just kind of this black box situation? Or has society moved to the point where we can actually answer these sort of things with mathematical certainty?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts going on there. I don't know if
Go ahead, brother. You're the guest.
cool. Yeah.
Drop them.
So the first thing that I think is really interesting to think about is that comment you made about technology, right? So if you look at like the history of writing in ethics, just because that's what I'm into, and law policy, because those all kind of bleed across lines. Like humans have known about the importance of consequences following a behavior for centuries. Like the oldest known written legal code has rules that if you do X, Y will happen. Like we know it's important. What allowed Skinner, I think, to really push things forward was he had the way to record a rat's behavior and deliver pellets in a repetitive way. Like the technology was there that set him up with the data to kind of move that idea in a scientific direction. So I think technology plays a huge role. And I think the last 10, 15 years, we're at a really interesting time with computational techniques, the computer power that we now have access to, the amount of wearable data that we have on human behavior has, I think, put us into another unique domain where really cool things can happen and we can push our field forward. When it comes to certainty, though, I think it's still a bit like weather. So we know that, if you take a deterministic perspective on the universe, everything has a push-pull. If I measure everything, I can predict exactly where that cloud's going. But it becomes like this cost-effective trade-off. Like I don't really care how this leaf is blowing right outside my window. Although, sometimes it disturbs the songbird, so it does bother me at times. But point being, same with behavior. Like in theory, if we could measure everything and you take a deterministic view on the world, we should be able to predict with certainty how it all fits together. But at what cost? Do we have the technology now to do it? You also start getting into, I think, a great topic, which is we have all these different models that we can use to predict behavior, say like our physiology, the environment, how all that stuff comes together. Putting all those different models together into one framework to generate a single prediction is going to involve some really interesting math, theoretical collisions, almost all those models have some kind of probabilistic factor. You start adding those up, things get messy. So that then comes back not to an impossibility, but more, again, limitations. Where are we at? Where are we going? What's the function of all this quantitative modeling? What are we really after?
We need behavioral string theory. Is that what you're saying?
We do. I think we do, man.
Because I think my personal point shifted from like early as a clinician, learning a bunch of different things, realizing like, oh, this doesn't give me the practical utility like you were talking about when you're in a situation where you're trying to teach somebody something one-on-one, to then later realizing like, oh, like this is what this is used for. And it's used to be able to work at a scale that is beyond the n of one, is the way I've kind of, would you agree with that, or?
All the way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I feel like maybe I overuse this.
Not that you can't use it with the n of one. I think that would be
right.
the ultimate. But
first principles are different than pragmatic outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big thing.
Yeah. And where I feel like I use it most often in like an applied sense, when I look at like the applied work that I do, it's where I'm playing around with an intervention for hundreds or thousands of people, where I can't go in and manipulate the contingencies for every single person. And so I'm necessarily have to understand how I'm pushing the group around. That's practically what I'm left with. And when you start getting into those situations, or some of these alternative contexts, I think, where I can't change things every moment by moment for a learner or whoever's behavior I'm trying to change, math is really helpful, because you can start playing out with probabilities, uncertainty, how you're going to get the largest return on your investment for whatever you're manipulating, things like that. But that's also a different type of quantitative modeling than I think some of the quantitative analyses of behavior that are building towards complexity and dynamics. And even those are a little bit different than like data science, machine learning. Like all those are different languages, if you will. They're all different functions, different purposes.
Do you do have you done any systems design work or systems architecture stuff?
No, not practically. I've read a fair amount about it, and I think it's the idea, at least what I took away from it, the idea from the research that I was interested in doing. What I like about it is that some of those like systems flow diagrams and things like that, they force you to define how things influence each other. Yeah. And as soon as you have to do that, you realize like, oh shit, there's a lot I don't know. And there's a lot of assumptions I make. And I think that's really helpful. And so that's kind of I kind of touched that literature and realized that's helpful. And so that's when I started getting into some of those papers that I sent. It's like, all right, well, what about if I have this choice situation where there's like two outcomes that follow behavior and each is delayed and probabilistic? How can I think about from like a systems framework how different models are going to interact with each other over time, push around choice, things like that.
Well, in that one paper, it was interesting that you found the three different types of delays. Delaying for cost, or I'm sorry, delaying for gain, magnitude, and what was the third one? Yeah, probability. I'm sorry, correct. But there wasn't a probability for loss. And I wonder why. Can you guys
rewind just a little bit and give me a little more context?
Yeah. So he published a paper where they did a couple different experiments, multiple experiments to deduce, when it's all said and done, that people make decisions relative to or people delay or discount decisions relative to three potential outcomes. One is magnitude of the choice of the gain and or the loss, right? That was reciprocal, right?
Which paper was this? I've done a bunch that had a lot of shit going on.
The one that you just sent to us. Oh fuck!
Is it the cocaine one?
No, it was money. It was money choices.
Oh, was it the multiple outcomes one?
Yeah. Yes, the multiple outcomes one.
Oh yeah.
2016 effects of delay probability combinations on discounting in humans.
Yeah. So I'll pull that up just to make sure. So what we did within this line of research generally was a bunch of stuff. And then when we went to submit it, we got feedback that we needed to cut some things out.
Well, so here you have discounting in delayed gains, which makes sense, right? So people They discounted how, they took the money now rather than later relative to what it was because they didn't think the juice was worth the squeeze. Discounting probabilistic gains, again, if you put a relative component, they still delay or discount, and they then discounted relative to losses. But they didn't discount relative to probabilistic losses, which is like interesting. Like
Yeah.
you'd think that you would, if you're discounting one, you discount the other on the other side, just because you would imagine an inverted relationship, just a priori, if you just do a deductive thought experiment on it.
Yeah. And people often do. So if you look at like prospect theory, and the whole like loss aversion literature, a lot of that was born out of uncertain gains versus losses and how people make different decisions. The unique thing about, and this is a whole other fascinating aspect of quantitative analyses that I love, the unique thing about any independent variable manipulation is that it can take on a variety of ranges from what would effectively be zero, whatever that means for that value, to, if we're talking delay, infinity time, or probability 0 to 1 or whatever. Any independent variable manipulation in a lab experiment, I'm necessarily stuck to some portion of that full range. And it's always possible that you don't see an effect of your independent variable, but you are in the wrong range of the curve.
Got it.
Something like that.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I was wondering, like, what if, and that was one of the things that you put as a limitation. I was like, yeah, how would people discount differently if we were talking, instead of $1,000, what if we're talking about $1 million?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
What is that? What if we just add zeros or multiple zeros to the ends of the exact same things? How does that change relative to that kind of magnitude?
Yeah. So you get it's called the magnitude effect. You get a really systematic change, but it doesn't take like a linear change in discounting. You get diminishing returns.
Got it.
Which is fascinating to think about too from like an economic perspective.
Can I real quick go back to that question that you asked, Ryan? Because I want to say something about that.
Which question?
When you're asking about the black box, you're doing that.
Yeah, and I guess for me it was just like it seemed like Guo was kind of like, hey, these have the chance of like getting very reductionistic really quickly. Like, don't forget, right?
He's 100% right, and actually, the problem is that that's what happened to practice, but that's actually not what happened to EAB. EAB went so reductionistic, it flipped, and now it's, in my opinion, going towards complexity. Because they're doing research on not just variables or reinforcers or counts anymore. Now we've moved to relationships because we're talking about behavioral momentum theory. We're talking about delayed discounting. We're talking about reinforcer magnitude. We're even talking about MOs. So I think that when you start getting into the relations of things, you start getting into those probabilistic things because you're talking about pushes and pulls between objects, not just between the organism and their environment. So the applied side of the field is stuck on this organism and environmental exclusive relationship and not thinking of it as bidirectional, or thinking of it in terms of coming back, and also not thinking about it in terms of things hitting us from every different perspective, very much how Golddiamond would talk about it in a constructivist type of model.
Cantor.
And like, that's what's so yeah, I agree with you. It does have that tendency to do that. But I mean, like, holy shit. I mean, the world is so robust when you get into the math of it. And my thing on the precision, this is what I would say to that. Yeah, absolutely. But that just means you haven't done enough. You haven't added enough components to your algorithm,
just more work
or
to
whatever
be done,
equation.
Right?
Yeah. Because you start accounting for different variables, and why you need EAB is because EAB tells you what let's just say hypothetically, because Einstein's belief before he died was he could find a simple solution or a simple equation that explained the entire universe that would fit on one line of one page. So let's just take the Einstein never finished his work theory that you could get that size of an equation. Okay. I mean, that means you have probably 30, 40 variables, if not more, that you need to account for somehow on something like that. Well, you need to know the first principles in which they're derived and what controls them in order to effectively plug them into that over time. Which goes, again, David, goes back to what you were saying, is being able to integrate frameworks from other fields. Because one thing that I think is amazing about this quantitative thing, and I want to get your input on this because you work in such a diverse array of fields, is that it's really opened my eyes to, I was in this very much like exclusionary mindset where I thought everybody was doing shit work except behavior analysts. And now I'm totally on the other side where it's like, oh my God, there's some amazing, and of all of them, which one I discounted the most was sociology. And I'm thinking, holy fuck, actually topological models and all the cool shit these guys can do with like measuring like human populations and getting very just amazing predictive precise math models out of it on that end of the spectrum. Poli-sci with decision making, economics with decision making. I mean, even cultural anthropology with evolutionary models, biology. What are some of, so like, do you see that? Is that a, like, seeing a way to integrate those frameworks over time and being able to bring them into, number one, a behavior analytic vernacular, but number two, actually making it so that it's useful in some capacity? Like, where do you see that going? Or do you even see that as a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm actually really glad you brought this up. So two things that I wanted to respond to in that. First is Einstein's equation, where he has like all the variables on one line or whatever. If you ever dig into some of the other literatures that are really quant heavy, they'll have these beautiful equations that are, like 6-7 variables. And you're like, oh, that's nice. Let me pick at this one variable.
It's a book
and
of
you
math
realize,
to get there.
it's the proof. The proof is like 40 pages of shit to get to this, like what an upside down triangle means. So I always love that. Because like you're saying, it goes back to foundational principles. At the bottom of that is an observation in the universe. And those get built up via language, which is really fun to think about. The second thing in terms of integration and across fields. So I know that in parts of my training and experiences, I was under the impression that behavior analysts are the ones that are doing behavior science proper, and everybody else is playing.
For anyone listening, he did the nerd putting his glasses over,
pushing the glasses up.
What I find fascinating as now that I interact outside of behavior analysis, almost primarily, is that everybody's studying behavior, everybody's taking data now.
Exactly.
Like, it's a different game.
It's crazy.
And there was even the president of APA, it was in like 99 or 2000, something like that, wrote an editorial titled Behaviorism 1. And his whole point was that we no longer rely on introspection. Mentalistic models are often looked at with sideways eyes because you have to tie it to data on behavior. And you have to explain it in terms of what you did in your experiment. And the in-between stuff, you can theorize whatever you want, but at the end of the day, people are taking data on behavior. And I think even when I've gotten outside of psychology into like pharmacology, computer scientists, robotics, marketing.
Oh, their behavior is all the way.
Oh yeah, they're talking. I interact with a user experience designer who's we're working together on some research projects at my current place, and he knows behavior and experimental design probably better than I do in certain respects in the digital space.
From all that A/B testing.
Yeah.
UX UI was one of the first professionals I ran into where I was like, oh, you understand this stuff better than I do, and I went to school for this. I was like, holy shit.
In this behavior realm all day.
Yep, that's all they do.
So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think sometimes the science, how behavior analysis relates to other science, is taught in a way that's 50 years old.
Dude, I think it's even more than that. I think it's stuck in 1953 science of human behavior, and there's been a lot of shit that's happened since then.
Oh, we've done a tremendous amount.
We've done a tremendous amount of work, and actually, we're not. The thing is too is that other people are out there doing work at the same time, and a lot of it's better. I can't part of the dive that I've done, and this is my total mea culpa publicly, because I've been taking a shit on every other science on the planet for a while now, including psychology, and Mother Mary, full of grace, my bad. Because no, for real, dude. Because it's like, especially sociologists, I've been shitting on them for years. It's so critical to think about that behaviorism won, behavior analysis lost. Actually, to what I would say, my retort to that.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Because I think that the influence of where we are as a field, I think the vernacular, I think the conversation, I think the level of practice, the level of understanding, execution, and actually just the general scientific-minded curiosity. It's just not. It's different now. It's not the same. People are asking almost literary things, because you mentioned about getting used to reading JAB. And it's funny because when you dive into this kind of lit and then you go back and try to read applied published publications, applied research reads like fiction. I'm not joking. Because you're like, where's the calculation? This is conjecture. You just made that up. You're like, why did you? You can't actually say that. You're just saying that because it feels right. Like, So it's like you start seeing, I don't know, it starts seeing kind of vacuous and empty, and it's kind of, on the one hand, sad, but on the other hand, it puts things in perspective very tightly, at least for me personally.
Yeah. Well, and I think that also is a great highlight too of when you start moving from the fly in the black box into an open. If I just open the lid, shit gets so complex so quickly that it's not as though that those are bad scientists or bad researchers. It's just there's so much to account for that I'm gonna implement this intervention in the kid's home. That's all I know that I did, because the rest of it is just wild, and we saw an effect, and that's great, and so you could probably do it. But that kind of gets back to that question about, will these fields integrate? And I think they have to. I think we're all building towards it. I think everybody's, behavior, data, modeling, that's what a lot of people are doing. Everybody's interested in predicting the future for whatever reason, what people will do.
Well, I mean, when we go back to, we were talking about philosophical questions and ethics before. You said, I mean, like, what is the purpose of the human animal? What did language and socializing and fire give us? It gave us the ability to engage in conjecture with our other human beings, and that means talking about the unknown, and trying to discover and fill in the gaps for the unknown. There's a reason why the greatest argument that scientists give, and it's interesting that every time you leap to conjecture, it's called the God of the gaps, because that's what by demystifying the universe, we're actually discovering the mysteries of the universe in and of itself. So it becomes a self-fulfilling exercise of it's beautiful, man. And I do agree that the integration seems to need to happen, because it seems that a lot of fields are kind of it's not just us, it's a lot of fields hitting a lot of stagnant points. And we're seeing kind of the culmination of that. I mean, to bring it back to an ethical perspective, do you think that a lot of this cold rationalism has led to some of the failures that we're seeing in society, and is maybe leading to some of the challenges that we're having to deal with here on a day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say without being around and all those people who are writing policies and doing stuff. But we know what's really fun about the behavioral economics literature in general is they just point out how irrational humans are. And so I think that to the extent that people were building policies or designing systems under the assumption that it was rational agents from the behavioral economic definition of that were behaving in these systems, you're surely going to get it wrong, because you're putting a square animal in a round cave, and that just doesn't fit. And so one thing that's really cool about the behavioral economics literature in particular, I think, is that they're highlighting all these different ways that we aren't rational. And we need to think about that when we're designing policy, when I'm helping people live better lives.
Well, I mean, and see, the thing is like, so let's just take that behavioral economics perspective of the rational actor, right? They're not the only ones doing that. Political scientists and game theorists are doing irrational actor models like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, physicists, that's quantum theory is really irrational quanta. It's irrational particles. That's what they're doing mathematically. So everybody's at that point where they're trying to solve a solution for irrational behaving things or uncertainty.
Yeah.
And then so let's all get together and share notes. I feel like that's a big thing that's holding it back.
Yeah. And I think we can learn a lot too from, so one thing that I don't think we've really brought into behavior analysis yet either is this idea of distributions of data. And so we think about like a behavior occurs, but even responding per minute or whatever, it's going to follow along a distribution. And other fields are really advanced in how they think about distributions of our dependent variable and how those interact. And you can learn a lot from that stuff. But from a human behavior perspective too, what's also a fascinating question that I play around with a lot is, on one hand, we want to predict how irrational are you so I can account for it. Simultaneously, I want to use the best tools, machine learning, whatever I have possible to know what is the most rational choice in this situation. And then I want to push you to that, because if that's the best decision to make. So we're in kind of this really interesting position where we know humans are irrational, but we want to know what is rational. And then is it good to connect those? I don't know. These are open questions. Should we be designing all sorts of irrationality?
Yeah, I don't
Learn
know.
from other fields. I've been thinking about this stuff for a while.
Yeah.
I'm not the only one.
Well, the push and pull is interesting because it makes you wonder. This is another question that came to me as I'm reading all this stuff, and I'm like, should we be doing this? How do we get from is to should? You know, because there's a lot of conversation just in general in the world about what everyone should be doing, but how do you get there? How do you get from is to ought? You know, that's Hobbes, right? That's Thomas Hobbes' big question. I mean, like again, Leviathan. For those who are wondering who that is, he wrote Leviathan, classical writer. But what? How do you reconcile those things? Because you say you're a bioethics guy and like you're into ethics right now and that kind of thing. How do you jump from is to ought?
That's a beautiful question. If I had the answer to that, I'd be well published, and I'd
You'd be rich as fuck too, by the way.
I don't know that
He's like, I'd be on much bigger podcasts than this.
I'd be on Rogan, bitch.
Y'all be paying me to be here right now. Yeah, no, I don't know that I have that answer. What I think is fascinating, and this kind of gets in that whole like moral relativism, moral realism question, is that, you know, from a purely operant perspective, we know that when you stand up and you say ought, that's a function of your learned history, and there's a set of facts that lead to that verbal statement, and that can't be denied.
But that doesn't make the statement true in and of itself.
No, exactly. Though. No, it doesn't. And that's what's
that just makes a statement true for you relative to your experience.
Yeah. Well, and even the loosely speaking content of that verbal statement is an effect of the contingencies at play, or that I might predict might occur in the future or whatnot. So I could lie to you, essentially, is what I'm saying, or say something that deviates from my learned history, and knowing that things are going to change. And matching tells us a lot of interesting stuff about reinforcers in that way too. So I don't know. I think it's a hard question.
Yeah, it's the age-old question, right?
Yeah, but then you also think of things, and you know, I asked this question maybe 2 years ago in the ethics and behavior analysis listserv. You know, how do we define moral progress?
Oh, fascinating question.
Because you know, and again, this is my learned history.
John Rawls would have an answer to that.
Oh, he would. He has a pretty good answer to that. But we look at like the events going on in the world right now, right? And I feel very strongly that it's not right to put your knee on someone's neck. Right? Yeah. That to me seems wrong.
Yeah.
And I think to the extent that we respect all life, that's moral progress. But then you get into that question, well, how do you know that is? What do we mean by that? How do you define that? And those are also those are hard questions. It gets back to that moral realism, relativism.
Do you think that, personally, I think that there's a way to find a relativistic angle that provides the foundation and the support that you get from a realist perspective. Because I mean, like and for anyone listening, let's just bring this. I just want to make sure that we're not losing people here. Moral realism is basically that there's such a thing as an absolute truth. There's an objective truth in reality. Like this thing is objectively wrong. Moral relativism is more a question of this thing is wrong because of where I'm standing, based on the way I'm looking at it, from my positioning, from my learning history, and my lifetime and my existence. Okay, so it's true or wrong. It's right or wrong to me, and whatever, but not necessarily right or wrong because of how it exists in nature. Right. So that's the distinct difference. Some could also argue that's where like moral realists a lot of the times too are usually religious because they derive their truth or their ethics or morality from God and is an absolute authority. So it's like, think about it like that. And then relativists are usually postmoderns, but whatever. So, and some people are going to get turned off by the fact that I just made fun of that because that's become like some type of online meme trope, but whatever. And there's a great paper written by Moxley, 1999, called "The Two Skinners." Everyone should read that. So anyway. You like that? You read that paper? Great paper, right? Yeah. It's a good paper. So anyway, one thing. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, I think the way that you do that is by. I think that's where science comes into play, and I think that's where rationalism does come into play. I think that's what the Enlightenment did for humanity. I think what the Age of Reason brought in a way to separate the indulgent self from decision making, and left it to cold rationalism, not cold in terms of like inhuman, cold in terms of objective relative to the facts and the variables available, that led to what led to C.S. Peirce and then William James, which led into Skinner. I mean, like You can track these things from their like moral and ethical lineage for the type of truths they pursue. And I mean, I think pragmatism, which is what if you're a behavior analyst, you're a pragmatist. I mean, you should be at least. That's how you derive that truth. Your truth should be defined by the best evidence available with the best possible argument that you can make from that. And it's okay that it's not absolute, but it should be relative to those things and not just based on some preconceived ideological conception or framework other than that based first principle. Because I mean, that's how base first principles need to be reducible. I mean, that was Kant's whole thing. Like, it was like, how do I come up with a generalized verbal rule that is that will create the most amount of good with the least amount of restriction? I mean, that was what the categorical imperative is. I mean, so I don't know. I don't know how the hell you do that and have this kind of conversation without having a philosophy degree and or computational science behind what you're saying, so that you can get to that point where you see everything like the fucking Matrix. Because honest to God, like the Matrix, like one thing about this whole journey I've been on is that like on the real, I'm convinced it's not. I understand now why there's people who think we live in a simulation. And I know I'm saying that, and like people are gonna be like, "Fucking, that's like for real." Mathematically, it's possible. Like, and it's like real possible. But anyway, so that was my little sidebar. So yeah, I think that's how you get to odd. I think you can have a relativistic perspective and still and do that. And I think that's how you get from is to odd. I think part of it though is how do you do that? How do you do that with dissension? How do you do that and navigate the terrain of dissenting voices? And I don't know how. That's the difficult needle to thread, because not everyone's going to agree. Part of the problem with ideological models is that they assume that everyone shares that baseline perspective, and that's not necessarily the case.
But that's again, I think, where science could come in. And I think if we think about this whole big data computational revolution, if we have data on how decisions are played out around the world, and we say, all right, this seems like the right thing to do, and there's a proportion of people that say, no, I think actually X. Great, let's run an experiment. Test it.
I know, man. I just want to
computational analyses.
I don't want to go too deep into this because we're going to have to have conversations on examples. I've had enough of that. I've had enough internet drudgery for me for a while, so I'm trying to keep it as clean as possible. But I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, at some point though, it starts getting into emotional outputs and that kind of thing. And how do you quantify that stuff? How do you do that? And also, I mean, institutions lag.
What happens when people, like your assumption there, David, which I think we all hold, is like people have to value science to be able to even move the needle forward like that, right? So
there's a big anti-science push right now, and on both sides of the aisle, and that's a difficult thing to reconcile. I don't know what, because I mean, on the one hand, logic and rationalism are vilified. On the other hand, they're necessary and sufficient to produce new knowledge. And
see, my gut is that's just a really vocal, loud thing that's going on. Not to judge it myself right now, but that what's going to really run behavior here at the end of the day, regardless of what field you're in, is going to be those people that are taking some sort of scientific approach, whether they talk about it or not, right? Like the people running the numbers, the ones collecting the data, like it's going to push forward. You might not like it, but it seems to be what happens, right? Maybe not in the short term, but over time. So I don't know, because it seems like it's very hard to, it takes a long time and certain experiences to be able to start to value the scientific approach,
yeah, I'm
right?
with you on that. No, that's of course, all those things, of course, prefaced absolutely 100% on that. That's undoubtable. So let's
long game too. I mean, like we're sitting here, I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, looking at a screen that's this wide. Y'all are dispersed around the world. We're talking live time with video recording of this event. Like science made that possible. Like if you look at the advancement, long run, things that work went out, which gets back to pragmatism, science, rationality. So, there'll be ebbs and flows. I think people will go against it. But until we find a better way, and again, I'm biased. I'm obviously a scientist.
Yeah, we all are.
How about this? let me just transition to a little bit more of a light, fun topic. Let's get to machine learning real quick. Do you do anything with AIs too, or is it mostly just robots?
So I do all stuff with machine learning, which is a branch of artificial intelligence,
Okay,
but more. It's not involved in robotics. It's only
I meant digital
essentially.
robots, but
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I didn't mean
Yeah,
actual
yeah,
robots.
yeah. I was like, I don't want someone to reach out and be like, "Can you program this robot?" No, I can't. Yeah. It's all machine learning, big data analytics, find patterns,
So,
predict behavior.
why don't we talk about what you can do with big data? Because we reviewed a book on the podcast called "Everybody Lies." That
Oh,
was
I love that
basic.
book.
Great
Yeah.
book, right?
Yeah, I love that. Good book. Nice.
And the dude obviously did a dissertation and published a book and on with big data, Pornhub, Google data. Um, I mean, I don't know. Tell me what are your thoughts on what we can do with it? What should we be doing with it? What is I mean, just go off. What you got?
It's gonna change the world. No,
It is
will.
gonna. It's already
is
changed the world.
Yeah. So
Sure.
I think you look back at early behavior analysis, right? And those guys moved out of the lab into a psychiatric facility. They had some general rules, and they were trying to figure out, what do I do? That's kind of seemingly where we're at with big data right now. The amount of data that we're collecting and storing and have available is crazy. But it's not always on the right things. It's not always on things that actually help us answer a question that we're interested in. And the volume, variety, and all this that it's coming in requires a special skill to be able to play with. Same with like the early behavior analysts, right? You had a special skill to try to figure out what's going on here. So that's kind of where we're at. The opportunities that I see in it, and especially for behavior analysts, is we understand behavior environment relations. So when company X wants to change health behavior, for example, right? And they're collecting all this data on their on employee behavior or whatever, their clients or patients or whatever. We know what data to collect. We know what matters. We know the environmental variables that would be great to have. We know the behavioral variables that we should probably be capturing. So I think behavior analysts have a great way of efficiently weeding out things that we don't need, and as well as a nice framework to analyze it in mass. What I think we don't necessarily have is the skills to manage the big data, and then also to play around with some of those more complex analyses where other fields are beating us at that. Complexity and dynamics, we're not winning that game. And that's what actually brought me to machine learning generally, because I was trying to figure out how do I predict decision making where someone has one choice. So I'm not steady state. This isn't hundreds of responses. You're entering a situation, you make one decision and you're out. Do I operate on my terminal cancer, my brain tumor? That's like one decision. And other fields are predicting what people do in that situation with like over 90% accuracy. That's kind of got me looking like, wait, how are these guys so good at it? And so those are kind of the small wins, I think, that shows what we can do with big data. If you have the right data, you have the right behavior, the right environmental, all those things lined up, then computers are fantastic at allowing us to identify patterns in these complex situations, as well as understanding how they dynamically change over time. And for what also kind of really hooked me was that this stuff is right at your fingertips. It's a few lines of code. It's obviously good to go in, understand the math, what's going on under the hood. But just like the listeners of this podcast, they don't really need to know the intricacies of matching law to understand more reinforcers will increase this behavior and not the other one. Once you have a general understanding of how you can use machine learning and some of these tools, they're really powerful and allow you to ask really interesting questions. If the right data is there.
Do you think that the marriage to single subject design has been a primary contributor to hindering that progress?
I don't know. It's a good question. So I get really excited about the conversations about statistics generally, because I feel like statistics is this broad concept that covers everything that has math in it for a lot of people. But really, the issue is null hypothesis, significance testing, p-values. That's the logical inconsistencies. It just doesn't make sense from what we're actually trying to do with statistics and things like that. And so I think that's part of it, is that those statements about statistics generally tend to overgeneralize, and so people are
and more and equations and like looking.
and just thinking about math and what we can do with it generally, I think is kind of one challenge in that domain. I think the other really interesting thing about single subject research that I think plays to our benefit is that with the rise of big data, a lot of people are circling back to what they're calling individual level modeling or user level modeling. So they're now interested in time series of one person and all my wearable data because they can now. And we're great at that stuff. Like we should be leading that charge. It should be behavior analysts that can play computationally with data to use
individual level
God.
modeling is what it's called.
Yeah.
And what field is that?
If I have, and a lot of, well, I guess some of the stuff that we're doing in behavioral health. So, if I have individual data on how, like your wearable technology, how much you're running, physical activity, if you keep a little diet log, what you're eating, things like that. Before, sociologists were great because they looked at groups, patterns, and trends. And some of the early big data stuff was cool because they were mining Twitter or Reddit or Pornhub like that guy and realizing like at the population level, there's more people that are using Pornhub than say they're using it, right? And that's interesting. What's cool is as we've gotten more advanced in these areas and technology's gotten better and our math has gotten better, people are now saying, I don't have to just look at that population data. I can pick out this user and I can follow them in time and I can cleave that distribution into thirds and I can send a different intervention to each one of those thirds. What we do as behavioral analysts is scale it up. So I think, long story of circling back, I think the focus on single subject design prevented us from getting involved in some of the group population trends, which is really interesting. Yeah. And I think when we get out of the ability to manipulate and control direct contingencies 40 hours a week for somebody, those skills are good to have. But coincidentally, ironically, I don't know. I think we're at a point now where the train hasn't quite left the station yet because people are circling back to single subject modeling, time series data. They call it different things.
When I went to Quantified Self, they have a conference usually every 2 years. But it's quantifiedself.com. Just a bunch of nerds from any walk, any area, interested in typically wearable technology, or they just fashion their own devices. They'd figure out how to hack and put together things to where they could just measure some sort of behavior. When I went to their conference, the opening keynote, I think it was in like 2016, was basically like, how do we start to understand scientific research methods at the individual level? And I was like, holy cow. Like, this is the big theme and question of this entire conference. Like, we got this answer, like, or at least a really good start, right? Figuring it out. And it was interesting because I got involved on their forums, chatting with a couple of the founders, talking about behavior analysis and like the role that it could play, understanding some of these things. And I would attribute the reaction to like a very poor pitch on it. I was probably a little too strong, but I was like, yo, we got the answers. And one of the guys just had a really bad run-in with behaviorism in the past. And he's like, basically like, you get the hell out of this conversation. Like, we don't talk about this stuff here. And I was like, all right, like you run the forums, you run the company, like my bad. But fast forward 4 years later, and I see his name listed as one of the presenters at ABI next to Al Nuringer. I think is who it was. And I was like, no way. And so I reached out to the dude, and he was just basically like, we found some really cool, useful stuff in there. And, I'm going to ABI to go learn from some of these people. I think he attended Squab as well.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And I was just like, I feel like I've lived that, like people coming back around, but in the other way, like.
Yeah. That's so cool you have that experience.
Yeah, and there's still, it was, I didn't get to catch up with him, and I don't know if he put together, I was the asshole on the internet for him, that then later emailed him saying like, yo, you want to catch up at ABI, but it was really cool. Clearly, there was others that were pretty good at kind of getting the foot in the door with those folks, and it fascinates me how there's that's probably just one example of many other fields that could use some of our skill sets, logic, learnings, whatever, right? Just this one little sliver that could lead to this collaborative like explosion of potential opportunities, right? For our field, for humanity, etc.
Could you imagine though actuarial tables based on your own life decisions instead of just based on average?
It's
Your
being
fucking
done.
insurance premium would be $1 million. This nigga, like they're like, this guy got drunk in college way too much. You almost killed a guy. I mean, like, could you imagine? It's like I'll take the averages, bro. I'll take the averages.
He keeps visiting the cliff jumps every weekend.
Exactly. I mean, they do it now. They have those chips that you put in your car for discounted for driving safe and stuff. I mean, that's basically single.
It gets even creepier.
Yeah,
So
I was gonna say, let's get into
of,
creepy. Yeah.
So when I was coming out of Hopkins for the postdoc, and I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do now? I took part in this data science internship through Insight, which anybody that's interested in stuff, I highly recommend it. 16 weeks, really intense, but you learn a lot of great skills. On the back end of that, you interview with a bunch of companies with the idea that maybe they have a job for you. There are companies, big companies, that are we're hiring people like me to come in and play around with social media, scraping social media.
I want that job
understanding
so bad.
behavior, right? We know Facebook and Apple, Google, they're all doing this. I think the secret is like, why aren't more of us using it to help humanity? Because people are doing it. It's so easy to scrape data.
I mean, they did that documentary. They did that documentary on Cambridge Analytica.
Oh yeah.
And all that. Social. I mean, like
hack.
That's the thing that you were saying before, how like all these guys know more. Like when I was doing some research on this, I bumped into you mentioned you encountered that systems literature, systems design, and system architecture kind of led you down the path you're on. And like, it's because it's amazing. It's really, it's how you imagine geniuses think when you look at that. You're like, this is how smart people look at the world, obviously, because it's a brilliant way to organize things. It's parsimonious, it's effective, it's clear, it's cause and effect oriented, it's empirical. I mean, it's everything. It's based on an evolutionary design idea behind it, because it's always focusing on those feedback loops. So it's selected by consequences inherently. Like, you have all these different principles that are playing into it, and you're like, well, where do they teach all this stuff? Oh, Yale, Harvard, MIT. Oh, okay. So basically where rich smart people go, and the rest of us suckers are out here trying to do our best, trying to figure shit out, like, what the fuck? Like, you can't really learn that anywhere else, or at least not the good versions of it. And you're like, oh, that's the problem. Part of the problem is inaccessibility and then limited access to what these more advanced disciplines really look like at their highest level of achievement. So I think there's a barrier there too that's part of this. But the point that I was trying to make about it is that, like, I think that a lot of it has to do with how we organize the information that we have in front of us, and what narratives we bring to the table as we're trying to interpret it, and then what we do with that long term as an individual, or as a field, or as a person, or as a professional. Like that, those relative positions matter a lot in what you're looking at. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, dude, because systems design is unbelievable stuff. It's really amazing. Listening to some of those guys talk, you think you're listening to a philosophy conversation, but really they're really providing you an empirical breakdown that is unbelievable. And they can start from the beginning to the end.
Right. Yeah, and it's all grounded in data observations and how those things fit together, which I think is, at the core, that's what quantitative analyses are about.
Yeah. How do you think we can break the social? Do you think that it's possible for us to break the social media algorithms? Because, I mean, basically what I think happened is Zucks and your boy Dorsey and all those guys basically sat in their dorm rooms and accidentally cracked a massive behavioral code. And instead of sharing it with the world, they made it their own and made us all crack addicts, well, phone addicts.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we undo that?
How do we undo it?
I heard put that genie back in the bottle?
I heard someone refer to Facebook as the cigarette of the 21st century.
Dude, it is. It is. It's digital cigarettes, man.
And I was like, wow. It made me really step back and think about my consumption behavior the last decade. And I was like, you know what? I could see where you're bringing that in.
I'm a 2 Facebook a day kind of guy.
Yeah, and have you ever taken a break from it for like 2 weeks?
Yeah.
And then you get back on for like 20 minutes and your brain just feels a little different. Like you can feel it interoceptively. Like it just hurts a little and you're like, I'm
You
not
don't
sure
like
what's
it.
going on, but
Yeah.
space it out, you know? Like,
Sorry to derail. What were you going to say originally, though?
No, well, because it is like being a drunk who needs to drink. You don't like being, but whatever. Anyway. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I don't know, man. I feel like we should crack that code. Someone should do that. We should be doing that research. How do you do that research?
You know what? That's another thing too. I think. Wait, like, how do you become a researcher at like Facebook? Is that what you're asking?
No, I mean that. Or how do you do the research to break social media? Like, I feel, as I've been asking myself these big questions, trying to work out my own research trajectory and trying to work out my own degree situation, like I keep landing on all these amazing ideas that are humongous, but there's no practical way for me to do that shit. I, number one, don't have the skills. I don't know anybody on how to go about doing that. And like every person I encounter really isn't into, everybody's got their own shared interests or whatever. So barred from quitting everything I'm doing, going get a computer science degree and an advanced mathematics and then maybe neuroscience and then coming back to do the like it seems like it's going to take a lifetime to get back to this point. Where is the beginning points of this stuff? What would be your thoughts on that?
So I guess my journey kind of falls along that line. So I originally, got interested in quant and then was like, oh, how do I build towards complexity? I need to learn how to code. All right, as I start to build out these experiments, how do I start combining variables in complex way? Oh, I need to understand data science and math. How am I going to scale this? So I need to learn how to build apps or whatever. And at some point I realized I can't do that. I'm going to be 60 before I ever do anything with my life. And so for me, it's like NASA sending a ship to Mars, right? You give up on the idea that I'm going to sit in a lab by myself and do things. And you recognize that teams of people collaborating with their own expertise, that's how you build a rocket ship. And that's how we figure out how to scale behavior analysis and push it into political science to change policy around the world. Or we figure out how to increase green initiatives and reduce oil consumption. Like getting over ourselves, working with a variety of people that have expertise in other domains. Because again, kind of looping back to the beginning of the conversation, everybody's playing with data now and everyone's focused on behavior. Like we're not just the only cool kids in the room anymore.
If you didn't have to worry about money, what is the one problem you'd work to solve?
Objective ethics.
Oh man,
the answer to that is no. I'm kidding.
It's fucking impossible.
No, yeah, exactly. I'd sit in a mountain by myself and try to solve that. No, I think it really would be how do we use technology to scale ways of improving people's healthy living.
Measure progress, like you already said.
Exactly. Right. And not in like how do I get everyone an iPhone, or whatever, but like in the Peter Singer Life You Can Save way. How can we think about on a global scale the greatest return on investment to scale things we know are effective? You just getting them into the right hands.
Have you read any of the Hayes pro-social stuff? Big one, and what's the other guy's name? Atkins?
David Sloan Wilson?
Yeah, David Sloan Wilson.
No, I haven't. I have the stack. Are you talking about the recent books and stuff that have come out?
Yeah, they put out some pro-social. So there's been a couple articles too, but nothing.
I have a few of the new books, but I have not yet read them. As my list of books just keeps stacking up behind me.
Yeah.
Are they pretty good? Along those lines, I'm assuming?
I mean, they're along some of those lines. They're a little more ideological. They're a little too ideological for my comfort, if I'm going to be totally honest. Not that I don't think that they're amazing work, but they're ideological. And I do think that they do create a couple of instances of false dichotomization where they create the only possible option as their opinion, the one that you would accept based on what they're giving. But I do think that they're very useful thought experiments, and I think they offer interesting takes. But I mean, just as much as Walden 2 or any other, I don't want to call them fiction because they're actually not written as fiction. They are based in the literature, and they do provide a non-narrated framework. But it is definitely ideological. Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
They're the amalgamation of like that 40, 50 years of thinking, right? Kind of like being turned into here's how we solve it, right? It's almost slowly turning into a handbook.
I think one of the things that I and this kind of brings a conversation full circle, so I don't know what this does to us, but I think one of the missing elements of all this stuff is being able to account for uncertainty, and that's and or just dumb luck, some people chance, whatever you want to call it, whatever discipline you're at. And I mean, I think from a behavior analytic way, descent too is that, like, when you don't know what variable is going to be coming, and having these very definitive frameworks, to me, make it difficult to get there. But yeah, social media is the devil. So Facebook in particular is the fucking devil. I mean, it's just a fact. It's really bad. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting too. I think getting back to what can big data do for us also, and I think there's this system that's been built up how to change culture, right? We have data now on everything, so we can also, that's another area of behavior analysis. I think we do a lot of theoretical thinking. There's open data sets. Let's go find some data and see if it fits. Let's start playing with some of this stuff.
Those things are I agree 100%, but I feel like they just aren't valued in our culture whatsoever. You have to leave behavior analysis and go find a different community if that's really what you value in.
I think you have to leave and not tell anybody until you're done, dude. Because honestly, and here's the thing, and I'm going to say this, and this might get some blowback, or people might not like what I'm going to say, but I think that, you have to decide whether or not you're going to take an inductive approach or not to a thing. And sometimes data points may conflict with what our perceived take on the variables is. And that doesn't necessarily negate the reality of the problem that you might be having, but the interpretation necessarily changes. And it makes me think of this, William Baum wrote an article when he was talking about Moeller behavior analysis, talking about a distinction between the evidence and the interpretation of it, and needing able to walk that line. And I think that when you're living in interpretation land too long, you start losing your grip or your anchor to the physical world, and you got to pull back a little bit and ask some uncomfortable questions that can go either way of the scale, so that you can actually come out with complex models that you can quantify. I think
the people that step outside of it, and this is where I'm really glad we've been friends or will continue to be colleagues in this sort of way, because I want to see where you end up in the next 10 or 20 years. I feel like what happens there is these people that step outside of it start to it's just so disconnected from the culture of behavior analysis as to this type of behavior analysis we're talking about, right? That it's just not valued. There's just too much of a disconnect there. So the one I bring up all the time is head sprout reading. Behavior analysis and a bunch of others, UX people, marketing, right, came together. And basically we're here's how you teach reading. We figured it out. We're done. It's automated. Just sign your kid up for this service. You got a 92% chance of it working if you just start here. but that isn't, those scalable solutions aren't talked about. They aren't taught. They're not praised, right? They're not those people were pushed out of the inner circles, or selected, I think, to get out of there because they just weren't finding the reinforcers, right? But when I was talking with Bill Hutchinson, one of my favorite finds in the last few years for behavior analysts, that William Hutchinson is what he publishes under, and did some work in robotics and other places. People are robotics and behavior analysis. I'm surprised that even made it through JABA to be published, because the disconnect's so huge, right? But it's fucking amazing work. And so I don't know where we were going with this to connect it, but the value of big data analytics. Yeah, that's where we need brave soldiers like yourself going out there trying to figure out how to pave this path forward. Because until there's a clear line there, and a lot of work, like you were saying, Dimitri, that's been done that shows the value of it. I don't think we're gonna have a solid funnel set up for behavior analysis getting into this.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to jump in before I lose this thought. I think it's also because we use a ruler and a protractor to measure something that requires, much more complex measurement. You can't measure we need to there's a actually it's
we're using our hands and feet to measure instead of even using instrumentation.
Because rate of response, and that's where I think, going back to Skinner and all that stuff, when we're talking about complex modeling, 3-term contingencies, 4-term contingency, why I was talking about that earlier in the podcast is because those are very linear models. I mean, not very, they are linear models. The period, not very, So I mean, but the world is nonlinear. The world is probabilistic. The world is varied. There is still chance. There's still that integral. Our integrals might be shrinking over time, but there's still that little space of unknown in the curve that we have to constantly account for that creates this probability of different outcomes versus the one you're looking at. So you have to be able to think that way. And that means you have to be able to do a scalar or a molar or a multi-level analysis that produces a multi-dimensional view of things. For example, rate of response, that's count over time, right? Okay. But then it's not, if how do you do that on a cultural level? You're going to do a rate of response on a cultural level. What is the fundamental unit that you would count a rate on a response? Some people would say decisions, but even then that's on the individual level. I guess you could say decisions from a policy level and kind of play with it that way if you want to treat a culture as an individual organism. But even that's not going to give you really what you want, what you're looking for, right? Because the real metric, if you're going to scale out, if you have a telescope, is space. Well, and that's what they did in physics. They were like, okay, well, space is actually a thing that we measure too, not just length and width and depth and height. Oh, it's space too. It's time and space. So you start pulling out and you adding these, like, so now you have a fourth dimensional behavior analysis, which you say that and you're like, what kind of fucking mushrooms you've been eating before you start your podcast? But that's, from a mathematical perspective, that's what it is. And like, that's where these quantitative models matter so much. That's where I think it matters when we're talking about this stuff and why it becomes so difficult, because we're interpreting. Anyone who's a behavior analyst who's trying to make, like we were talking about, that ought statement, they're looking at the world and interpreting through a hyper deterministic linear lens. Yeah. X happens, Y is going to happen because Z consequence occurred X amount of times. It created a history and literally just feeds back over time, right? But I mean, like, that's only right for that response sequence within the context of the period that you measured. If you continue to pull out on your telescope over time, that changes, and you need to have different metrics and more complicated models to run that thing through. And they're starting to exist more and more, but they don't exist in behavior.
This is a video,
and even saying that is heresy.
This is a video concept I've been working on, trying to figure out the word just right on just like how the ABC model was completely wrong. Like, I don't find it valuable, useful whatsoever anymore. Because
it's completely not valuable. It's only valuable with a very discrete type of application, and it limits the field in the applied sense. And that's why all the guys in EAB they're going to neuroscience. Like when we talked to Matt, that's why they're all going to neuroscience, because there they can play with all kinds of shit that doesn't even matter, and chemistry. So now they can have their cake and eat it too, and have a sandbox that is totally new and distinct. Or they're doing quantitative modeling because it's just easier to do it in math, because there's no descriptive way to do that without sounding like a 17th century philosopher. Like, I mean, there is no analog to it.
Yeah.
Well, and the uncertainty aspect too, I think, is why mathematical models are nice, because a verbal model of the same thing is really hard to work in some of that uncertainty. But, and with math, I can just give it a parameter. That's my E at the end of it. But it's interesting, and I think the takeaway, I guess, I think from that kind of goes back to what we talked about early on too, is like, what's the function of what I'm using my model for? That the ABC model, like you said, is fantastic in the right context with the right person. But for me, if trying to predict a single moment of whether or not someone chooses to have surgery on a brain tumor when they're 68 years old, that's not helpful. It doesn't quite get me there. I need something different, a little more complex.
And that's the disconnect. It's like we're taught that it applies to everything, right?
Yeah.
No.
And I mean, what's interesting is, so you could devil's advocate it. You could say, well, like, theoretically it does. If I knew your entire learned history, all the antecedent behavior, whatever.
At which point, like, where's your other variables there?
Right,
like,
right.
They're not captured in the A, B, and C. Sorry.
No. That, which gets us back to the pragmatist approach. Like, if I need to predict and control your behavior now with limited information, I can't rely on that. I'm going to have to play around with more complex dynamic models, incorporating multivariate, multi-level modeling. Uncertainty is going to be involved. We don't even have great quantitative models of verbal behavior. We know VB does fun stuff in behavior analysis. There's a lot of cool stuff in like machine learning, natural language processing. Like, all that has to be figured out. And there's no reason we can't steal from other disciplines. Like, we don't have to invent all this on our own either.
That's why
the thing, man. Other disciplines, man, like linguistics has got some killer models, actually.
Statistical linguistics, man. Anybody out there is into VB?
Dude, I mean, could you imagine blending? That's the thing. Like, I've been bagging on statistics all this time, but I mean, like, honestly, like, That's the only way you can do it to get this real broad molar perspective. And like, you need the single subject to solidify the science and the event from a term of first principles. So that's where you get Newton. That's how you get planetary motion. But then if you want Einstein, if you want quantum, relativity, you got to start playing into this land of like probabilistic outcomes and like uncertainty and all these things where you don't know what's going to happen, and being able to generate different types of conclusions relative to variables. So I mean, like, yeah, man, that's the stuff that I wish we had better decision making framework on that, or we had better avenues to be able to work with other types of disciplines and bring that stuff in, because it's also what's hard about it, because the entry point is difficult. I've had to learn the jargon in the last 3 weeks of 2 other disciplines just to understand what the fuck their literature is saying. And when I get it, I'm like, holy shit, I can read it then through a behavioral lens and just do the translation.
We're all talking about the same thing.
It's like we're all talking about the same stuff. Exactly. It's just they use these words for this thing versus what I use, and they're inferring agency a lot of the time, which is a little bit different, but not. It becomes kind of an irrelevant point in most instances. Like, you should be able to like see past that and move on. What? Oh, so anyway, yeah, it's
You froze
so
for just like a split sec.
How do we do that though? Like, that's the other thing, is like, we got this barrier to entry. How do we consolidate all these jargon laden disciplines that are doing all this amazing work into something we can actually use to help the world? Because I think going back to what we were talking about public policy, dude, if you go back and watch a YouTube video that C-SPAN, like Mark Zuckerberg talking to fucking senators and Congress people, I mean, like, it was like a kid trying to explain a VCR to their grandparent 30 years ago, and them saying, I don't know what you kids are into these days. Like,
control the world.
Yeah, and this guy literally controls. He is the Wizard of Oz for all intents.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I guess I have one comment that hopefully will ease that transition, and then I have a plug. So the comment is that if you dive down to the heart of statistical linguistics and all that stuff, they're talking about counting the number of words and the sequence of words, chains of behavior. Skinner talked about that shit in 1957 DB. Like, it's that's all it is. Counts of words, distance between words, and then you play with numbers because you can do more fun things with numbers. So people shouldn't be afraid to dive into it, because I'll say this not in a good way, I guess. It's our approach, even though it's not our approach. It's science approach. If you push back to a scientific approach of behavior, you're going to be observing counts, distance between chains of behavior. Like, you're stuck there. That's the transition. Hopefully make it easier for people. It's what we do. The plug is, there's a group, behavior analysts who code, who are trying to get at this idea. It's a group of people that can code. They're interested in coding. They use it in their research, whatever. But it's to try to help other behavior analysts that are interested in learning these skills get involved, start tapping into resources, have like-minded people they want to bounce these ideas off. So I wanted to plug that group, because I think some people.
Is it a Facebook group? Is it a SIG? What is it? Like, just a bunch of,
not
like
a SIG.
Club?
It's staying independent, I hope.
Yeah, it's independent. There's
you got to keep that sort of thing independent, or else it's just going to get off the rails quick.
Independent. They're the only mission,
at least on the leadership and decision. Sorry.
Yeah. The only mission of the group really is to help behavior analysts that are interested in level up their skills in coding, because I think it'll help.
I need to make some new friends then.
Here's the Twitter. We'll make sure we include that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah, BAs who code, nice. Yeah, we need to get into this thing. We need to.
Well, and see, I guess one of the realizations I'm having, I've had this a number of times where I've talked with you a little bit, or like the one time we talked around Nava at the bar, was just like, I feel like I kind of wrote off too soon some areas. I need to circle back around. I know you were talking about the linguistic stuff and Skinner there. I know like one of the first things I was shown at Reno at UNR, they had a Sid Bijou room that was just kind of like dedicated to him. And if I'm remembering this right, I'm almost positive it was him that was spending a couple years looking at trying to quantify verbal behavior. And he'd have people code forever. Like, hours and hours and hours, like write down every single word, and they were trying to play with it. And basically they're just like, they couldn't find anything, I think was the like interesting. And they just kind of were like, this is a dead research line. And it was probably just purely because of limitations of the time again, right? Like just not quite the right time.
So that's another great opportunity to plug data science and computational models. So I do all this work, right? I get all this data. And back in the day, I had to take my ruler and like draw a line and then like calculate my slope and intercept. And
Yeah.
like, there's nothing here, you know? If I wanted to play around like with any kind of non-linear relationship, I had to know the model, all that, whatever.
And that was my understanding.
But now we can just say, here's my data.
Yeah, and my understanding was like people spent like multiple years, like 2 or 3 years collecting and trying to figure out this data, because it was all back in the days of like, when they were still drawing their charts. And they were just kind of like, yo, we're not finding anything. Like, and we spent like literally years of our lives trying to chase this down. So yeah,
robots, they do everything better.
Oh yeah, and you can just like drink coffee or like read a book while they do it.
I know, it's great.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's almost like we should figure out a way to build a society around technology so we can pursue our interests and let the robots do the hard work. It's weird.
So this behavior analyst who code, who's involved? You yourself, like who's behind the Twitter account, I guess, and like what are some of the visions?
Oh yeah, that's me behind the Twitter account.
Okay.
For now, I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm into social media as much as I need to be. So the idea is that you get a. Right now, there's a 6 or 7.
I'm into cigarettes as much as they let me get into the social circle conversations.
I can stand there in the book and think I actually smoke, but I'll stand.
That's
there.
officially a thing, by the way. Facebook is officially cigarettes. Like whenever you
was
like,
the
hey,
addict. I was the addict that's trying to kind of get back down to the social norms.
Yeah.
Man, I gotta go outside and smoke real quick. I'll be right back.
So it's me behind the Twitter account, but hopefully that'll fade out over time. There's a 6 or 7 originally. I think it's now up to like 12. That over the last month, essentially what we've done is design a LinkedIn page, a Facebook page, I think a basic website that are just going to be static landing pages. But that all the meat's going to happen in a Slack channel that we've been
I was going to say, are you
building.
doing a Slack community?
Yeah, Slack
Is
community.
it started?
That's what it's all going to be. We're going to officially launch end of July, early August.
I want in.
Yeah.
Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
okay?
It's open to everybody. So, you know, the idea again behind this is like, we want to create a community where people can learn to code, get into code, or we have a few members too that they don't code, but they use products that involve technology and coding. So it allows them to contact and reach out to people that know how to code that are maybe looking for projects. Or we're assuming at some point in time, researchers out in the world that will meet people that can code will perhaps interact with the website. Who knows? The idea is to keep it loose, keep it as a community of just people that want to help each other learn. No, there's no like project anyone's trying to, the group's trying to build towards or anything. Fantastic.
So you shared that decision making tree with me. Why don't we just talk out loud about that real quick and just say?
Oh yeah, sure. Let me pull up.
I'm a behavior analyst and I want to learn how to code, Dave. How do we do this thing?
You run. No.
Run like hell for your life.
So while I open this up, I'll say that's a great example of the static pages that we're going to have. We're going to have a few basic tools like that. So one is like how to get started with Python, how to get started with R, how to get started with Visual Basic, and then this thing that's like, what language should I even learn? And then after that, everything is going to redirect to the Slack channel where we have different things for like projects or different like a Python channel or whatever, so people can kind of learn what they're into.
Did you learn on your own or was that coursework?
I did, yeah. I learned on my own. So I got to University of Florida. I was interested in doing like EAB stuff. There were not funds to do research with rats, pigeons. So I had to pivot and play with undergrads. And I thought, the very first semester I was there, I had these stacks of these papers, that I had people filling out, going through these discounting trees and then recording data. And I just thought there's got to be a better way. And so that's when I was motivated to learn can I program and experiment using Visual Basic. And then eventually over time, when I was looking around at different languages and I wanted to see, what can I build applications with for mobile app or websites or If I'm interested in machine learning, what languages do I need to learn? And then that's when I pivoted to Python. So I do most of my coding there.
Did you make this decision tree?
I did, yeah, but I got good feedback too from the others on the community, so I can't
Cool.
take sole credit for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is, and this is again geared towards behavior analysts. So the
I'm
idea
gonna
is
share this on the screen just for the
R
few
R is
video
free.
viewers.
Right? R is free.
Yeah, R is free. Well, so a lot of these things, so all the languages are free to play with. What may not be free are integrated developing environments or other ways of actually implementing your code. So that's something to think about. So
Okay.
the idea is you're a behavior analyst and you're like, I want to learn how to code. The first question is like, why? Why are you learning how to code? If you're in a research lab or you're in some kind of environment, and maybe actually I should change it says, for example, a research lab. So if you're in an environment that is already using a specific language, you should probably just use that, because there's going to be people around that know how to code in that language. Most likely, a lot of your programs and systems are going to be coded in that language, so you might as well just learn it. If you have a reason to learn a different language, or you're not in an environment where people are actually coding, then another unique question, or the second question down here on the left, is what do you want to do with code? Are you interested in developing research tasks, analyzing data, or are you trying to get a job after you graduate? Because it's, if you want to use behavior analysis in a non-traditional route, that's a very value-laden phrase, but I'll use it because it's succinct. You might need skills that you're not taught in your graduate program. So that could be one reason you want to do it. So if you're interested primarily in analyzing data, we can just take that top path. Then another interesting question pops up of, are you going to be primarily talking with behavioral and social scientists, or are you going to be talking more with like computer scientists, engineers, and things like that? And the reason that becomes important is because a lot of the behavioral, social science, data analytics, statistical models, there's some really great applications in R. There's the Tidyverse, there's Shiny apps, there's all sorts of ways to implement that code in a really easy manner. So R is great, it's free. They have a free integrated developing environment, which allows you to code and then get feedback right away on what happens. So R is great there. If you're interested in playing around with engineers, computer scientists, things like that, I'll rephrase that, a greater proportion of production code. Like if I'm building an app that's going to be used in an environment, you're better off with Python than R, just because it's more widely used right now. And so the other thing that I'll throw out there too is that a lot of popularity of different languages can change over time. So this visual could be obsolete in like a year. Who knows? You just have to kind of keep up with the trends. So Python's also great because it's free. There's free integrated developing environments. You can do whatever you want in Python. For data analysis. The next branch there is research. So the question becomes, are you going to be programming something that you're going to run in a laboratory setting, like on a computer or something like that? Then great. Python and Visual Basic are great tools. They're free. They have free developing environments, so you can code everything and run a task in a computer using those languages. If you're going to be trying to push your tasks into like a web browser, so let's say I want to recruit research participants using like Amazon Mechanical Turk or like Reddit or Facebook or something like that, then you need to learn some slightly different skills perhaps depending on what you're going into. Python still does allow you to do that. There's CyclePy, and there's some ways that you can implement a lot of Python-based research tasks online. JavaScript is also great. That's how you can build out websites, and JavaScript is is often the language that makes it do things. Buttons pop up, they move around, you count clicks, stuff like that. And Django is a great, again, tool that you can use to write JavaScript code. So you'd want to check that out. Following that, the bottom path. So let's say I'm not really interested in analyzing data or research, but I'm more interested in like getting a job or creating apps or something like that. And if I want to do that, again, if you're creating apps or playing around with websites, Java, JavaScript, Swift, those are again some great languages for building out in a digital space. If you are interested in getting a job, but you want to play with data for a job, so like here we're talking business analytics, data analytics, people that are playing around with volumes of data that we don't typically touch in behavior analysis. Then you might circle back to like Python or R again because they're free, and you can do a lot of really advanced modeling techniques with that stuff. If you're interested in getting a job via coding, but you're more interested in like back-end development, so like how do I build databases? How do I build data pipelines? So like you collect data on someone's wearable, and that has to travel via the internet somewhere and get moved around to a place, to a computer where someone can interact with it. That's where you're starting to get into like C, C++, Go, PHP. How can I build out these computer science systems?
I like
And
this part. You should also get a degree in computer
I
science.
tried to be subtle there. Like you might be in the wrong field, but you know, you could get into management and use your behavior analytics skills there or something.
That's hilarious.
And then essentially after that, we get into all right, so if you're interested in none of the stuff I've talked about, like do you just want to build games or something? Or maybe you want to build games for research, I don't know. Great. C# is fantastic. And there's the Unity engine, which is also free and allows you to build 2-dimensional games, 3-dimensional games. I built virtual reality experiments with this. Really cool, really easy to interact with, so you can do that. And then after that, it's like if you're not interested in anything I've said so far, I'm not sure what you're into. That's that whole.
It says sorry friend, throw a dart and see which language you hit.
That's hilarious.
And you know, maybe I'm sure we'll have this out for like a week, and someone will say, "Well, what about this?" And we'll go, "Oh yeah, of course," and we'll update our model.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
So coding,
R
I don't know.
and Python
are
the two.
I love coding, as you can see. I think it's an important skill. Open ups opportunity, behavioral cusp for sure. And for most behavior analysts, Python and R are probably going to get you where you need to go.
Yeah.
Dude, I want to learn how to do this so bad. You got me
Come
so
join
amped
us.
up.
Yeah.
I want to do it so bad.
Yeah. It's fun.
I want to learn. I want to make a model. I want to be able to screw with models and just have the machine deal with itself, so I don't have to work with people anymore. I just want robots to do everything, so I don't have to like, fuck it, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, it is interesting, you know, especially with COVID working from home, and I've thought more about like, what do I do for a living? You know, I have robots push around symbols, you know, in the most basic sense. But there's value, I think, in behavior analysts getting into these other domains and having these skills. And even if it's just talking with people that think about the world differently and understanding, you know, variation selection. We know how this works. What's out there? If people are pushing around behavior, I want to know about it. If it's a variable way of thinking, is it more effective? Great. If not.
Could you imagine what would happen if someone with the skills of a computer science major and the ethics of a behavior analyst actually did, you know what I mean? That's the thing that I think is the collision that's missing. Because right now it's been an amoral enterprise. Not immoral, just amoral.
There's a group down at, I want to say University of Miami, who just got a grant. It's a behavior analyst who primarily works ABA, severe behavior, I think. And they got a grant to interact with the computer science department. It's like a multi-year grant to do this. Figure out how you guys are going to work together and figure stuff out. But yeah, the researcher down in Miami is Yanneris Leon, University.
Okay, perfect. That's exciting. Yeah, so I think, Dimitri, we need to have some recurring segments on this, like soon. Like we need to plan the next one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Going down this quantitative road to just investigate this has been, man, I have not had, you know when you're learning new stuff and like you've been working on a problem or something and out of nowhere you get it and you haven't been getting it for a long time and you get that like elevated like fuzzy feeling at the top of your scalp.
It's like when you take
like,
a break from social media
my brain
and you come back.
grew. Yeah.
Yeah, dude. That's why when I was saying earlier, I try to get into at least one equation today that like scares me. It's chasing that feeling, you know, because it's amazing when you hit that equation that first time and you're like you like close the book and you're like, I don't know what's going on here. And then the next time you circle back and you like get half of it and you're like, oh, I see what's going on here. And then the next time you get the whole thing. And then in 6 months you read through it and you're using that model in another model. It's just that process of learning how the world works.
It's deriving unbelievable relations.
Yeah.
It's
Sure is.
unbelievable. And
Yeah.
like, dude, I've been exploring this. I've been in a continuous state of that emotion
Yeah.
for like 3 freaking weeks. So it's like
It's amazing, right?
I can't believe it, but it's like a number high. It's and I know that, and I'm not just saying that for the podcast. Like legit, I've been walking around like Siddhartha just got out of the fucking Bodhi tree, and I'm like fucking feeling real enlightened over it. Like it's really an amazing feeling. So I really encourage everyone to go down this road because it's
and
unbelievable.
Props to you and others that are trying to make it more accessible to others. You know what I mean? Through the behavioral analysis code and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really think it is a behavioral cusp, and really what prompted this was over the last like year and a half, 2 years. Every few months, someone would reach out and be like, "How do I learn how to code? Like, what are you doing? How'd you get there?" And then especially when COVID hit, it started becoming more frequent. I think people were sitting around and thinking like, "What am I going to do during COVID?" And so that's when I was like, maybe there's a I hate to say market like we're going to make any money off it, but maybe there's a place
a
for
pool
this
of
kind
people,
of a
yeah.
community, where
there's
again
a
it can
place.
be.
I wish I would have known about this when COVID first started. This would have been my.
Oh, it didn't exist.
It just started, yeah.
Yeah,
no, I'm
like,
talking about just learning, like understanding computational models just for myself.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a lifelong journey. It's like coding, So I code in Python, which is a high level language. There's some super nerds that like code in C, and they're actually like moving around bits on the computer. I can't do that. You can go down as deep as you want. And computational modeling, quantitative modeling is the same thing. Like at a certain point, you just have to say, I'm comfortable here thinking about the world. And casually, I'll also say that there's been in Java and JAB reviews that have come up where people are starting to play in this domain. I think it really gets back to that question of how do we bring it into behavior analysis and in a way that's meaningful, not just like a trick. Like,
Yeah.
I do this thing. Because I think
that's a big pitfall, isn't it? That's a pretty major potential pitfall as it becomes a party trick. It becomes more like a novelty rather than understanding the role that it can play in terms of actually utilizing big data sets in a substantive fashion.
I think at this point you got only hardcore nerds in our field that are interested in it for those reasons right now. Like they see.
Well, I mean, it's scary, dude. Honestly, like for me, it's been scary. It was terrifying to do it because like now I'm getting into stats and I'm trying to learn some stats. I'm getting all these different things that are completely out of my wheelhouse. So it puts you in a totally new comfort zone and completely out of your comfort zone in a way that it's scary. And for me personally, I'm starting to like. At first, it was really irritating having to reread the same fucking paragraph, not a sentence, sometimes 37 times, and have to look up 3 articles to understand what the fuck that one paragraph said. I mean, like it becomes this like web of nightmares. But if you work through that initial chug, it's some of the most rewarding reading that you can do and what we do, because it really does start illuminating and answering some of the more complex questions that you want to ask, and that's the thing we're asking right now. The field is pushing towards complex questions. We're not asking questions about reinforcement anymore. We're not just schedules, we're not asking questions just about like, what a pigeon's going to do based on this one thing, or just like what one kid with a developmental disability is going to do to respond to one intervention. We're asking questions about how do we move society. We're asking questions about how do we shape the world around us? What should we be doing versus what is happening? We're asking all these big idea, big heavy questions, but we're not implementing the necessary empirical process to get us to where we need to be going. And I think if that's a real thing that we want to do and achieve, which I'm all for, because I do think we can, quote unquote, save the fucking world. You know that, bro. Like, like this is how you do it. You do it by doing the hard work and the sweaty part. And that's getting into the numbers, really looking at them, being honest about what you know and what you don't know, learning and acquiring new skills, and feeling the discomfort that comes with stepping out of your comfort zone, and maybe branching out into other fields and being humble about that. Because the biggest thing that I think behavior analysis and analysts have going against them right now is the lack of humility from a disciplinary perspective. And I have to say, I've been humbled by some of the amazing work that I've read in the last few weeks. It's been unbelievable.
Cool.
So
that's awesome. I love hearing that, man.
Any
David, thank you so much for doing this, brother. We really appreciate you.
Oh,
Seriously.
without a doubt, my pleasure. There's too much good stuff going on here not to say yes.
Yeah. We'll have to do it again. We'll have to do a recap sometime. We'll have to visit back and give us an update.
Was there anything that you wanted to share that we missed?
No, I think that's about it. I think what would be interesting would be to chat in like 6 months or a year when some of the, so I've been at my current job only a few months now. So some of those projects get up and get going, and I have nice examples of things that work in that data science, behavior science space.
Well, I hope you're ready to be kind of like my go-to guy if I have questions if I'm trying to learn this stuff.
Absolutely.
I'm definitely going to be attacking R pretty hard. I have a feeling.
Nice.
So we'll see where that takes me.
Cool.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, this has been great. Thank you.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you. And the Flat Earth Society is officially up to 134,000 members. I'm sorry. Oh my God, no. The Flat Earth Society is 212,000 members, and they've added official Flat Earth and Globe discussion group that has 134,000 members, and they've added another group called Flat Earth No Trolls Seriously group with 64,000 members. So there's a
Flat Earth No Trolls Serious.
at least
we always look at how fast
twice the amount of people in one flat Earth group than there are behavior analysts out there in the world. So just think about that as we're talking about learning how to measure stuff, guys. We need to get back to measuring stuff.
All right. I was asking about
Marvelous.
that. Marvelous.